Thank you and good evening, everybody. Today I'm going to talk about the alignment of India's long-term strategy towards low carbon, climate resilient and just transition. I'm an associate fellow at TERI and I primarily work in the field of energy transition and climate mitigation. This particular topic is a very important topic because, considering that all the countries all over the world are moving across the path of low carbon development and finally trying to steer towards the net zero. Therefore, it is, very important for us to understand, what a long-term strategy towards low carbon development be like and how a just transition can be attained. In the Indian context, India has three, quantified targets that were set up in the 2015 during the Paris Agreement. And the first of them was to reduce emission intensity of its GDP by 33 to 35% by 2030 from 2005 level. The second was to achieve 40% cumulative electric power installed capacity from non-fossil fuel-based energy resources by 2030. And the third was to create an additional sink of 2.5 to 3 billion tons of carbon dioxide equivalent through additional forests and tree cover by 2030. India is very well on track and has achieved 24% decline in emission intensity from 2005 to 2016 and has also achieved 38% share of non-fossil fuels in the total installed capacity mix. Now, against that, I'm sure you all must be very familiar by now with this, chart and this picture, which is sourced from the Climate Action Tracker. And it clearly shows that even with the current policies, pledges, and targets, we are not consistent with the 2 degree. We are not 2 degrees consistent, and very far away from being 1.5 degrees Paris compatible. So we have to really bend the curve very quickly in order to limit our global warming, and all the countries therefore need to step up action to increase the pace and scale of change. And at TERI, we explore scenarios to examine what deep decarbonization implies for India. And here I present two scenarios or two studies. One, Engage, that explores the national and global actions to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And the other one has been already carried out, and it was on India achieving net zero energy sector emissions by 2050. In the Engage studies, there were different scenarios designed to evaluate long-term, low-emission developmental strategies as per the current or planned policies, including the NDC targets, and systematically exploring the mitigation space by examining the emission reduction by 2050 from the year 2010, given that new policies are implemented from 2025, and thereby systematically examining the 10% reduction from 2025 levels, and just seeing the mitigation space in terms of 10, 20, 30, 40 and 60% reduction from 2025 levels. So I will first discuss the Engage study results, and here you see that in this picture you see that these are the scenarios which were developed in the study, and the blue line indicates the BAU scenario, and the red and green indicates the ones below the BAU indicate the current policies and NDC scenario. So it clearly shows that we have been able to make quite a lot of emission reduction with the introduction of NDCs, and NDCs have clearly helped us in emission reduction. However, the lines below that indicate the subsequent emission reduction scenarios, and the deepest decarbonization scenario being the DDSC5, which is the 60% reduction from 2025 levels. And as you can also see that to stabilize the carbon dioxide emission at 2010 levels by 2050, around 4 gigatons of carbon emissions still need to be offset. And this can be done by electrification of end-use services, aggressive renewable energy deployment, and that is the key to plateau these emissions. And deeper decarbonization will require large-scale transition to fuels like hydrogen, I would say green hydrogen here, and biomass-based energy, and for the large scale of electrification, will also require battery storage to play an important role. And natural gas is likely to play a role as a transitioning fuel. And after that, I would talk about the role of electrification. Not only it is an enabler of as an enabler of efficiency gains, but it also acts as a potential decarbonization strategy across different sectors of the economy. Such as in the agriculture, we look at electrification of water pumping, electrification of tractors, which is a limited application due to the horsepower requirements of tractors. In the buildings, it is a very highly, buildings which are both residential and commercial are highly amenable to electrification, also provided that cooking also shifts towards electrified. And in the industry sector, we look at electrification of non-core industries and the shift away in the core industries from fossil-based captive power towards grid electricity. In the transport sector, we look at electrification of different vehicles, except in the heavy commercial freight segment. There is a limited application, and which due to the heavy trucking, for example, is constrained by the use of electricity or electrification, and therefore we will have to rely upon alternatives like hydrogen, or in the meantime we can rely on LNG, but ultimately we could rely on hydrogen as a decarbonizing fuel, biofuels as a decarbonizing fuel for a transport sector. And therefore, electricity, also to mention that electricity-based end users also bring in efficiency gains as compared to their counterparts. So now I'm going to focus upon the sectoral graphs, and you can see in the industry sector, for instance, if you see the 2051 the charts, you can see in the current policy scenario, it is heavily dominated by coal. And while in the deepest decarbonizing scenario, there's a diverse mix. Although the use of coal has not still ended, but it is likely to be constrained by technologies, especially in the steel and cement sector. However, the decarbonizing fuels include biomass, hydrogen, grid electricity, and natural gas. So in the transport sector, likewise, we see that the current policy scenario is heavily dominated by petroleum fuels. But since there are fuels that can completely decarbonize the transport sector, and technologically this sector can be decarbonized with the help of electricity, hydrogen, and biofuels. However, we need to ensure that there is ample of biofuel availability. Then we talk about the power generation, and the power generation in the current policy scenario is again heavily dominated by coal. But as we move to the deepest decarbonizing scenario, solar and wind are likely to play a very important role. And with higher electrification of demands as envisaged in the deepest decarbonizing scenario, we would still may require some level of fossil-based capacity for grid flexibility. However, the demand for these fossils would also depend on the progress of storage technologies. And therefore, efforts will need to be focused upon RE integration, battery storage, and with a sense of urgency. So now talking about the outcomes from the net zero analysis for the India's energy sector by 2050. This scenario shows the outcomes which are very similar to the ones which were obtained in the ENGAGE project, a deepest decarbonization scenario, which was a 60% reduction from 2025 levels. And according to this graph, you can see the blue line is the BAU. And you can see that in the net zero scenario, basically the objective was to see the technological feasibility of the India's energy sector to completely decarbonize by 2050. What we observe is that even by 2050, despite pushing all the limits, in terms of energy efficiency improvements, in terms of shift towards, decarbonizing fuels and technologies, some residual emissions still remain, which are of the order of 1.3 billion tons. And therefore, we have to rely on carbon sequestration options, such as, reforestation, wetlands, agroforestry, blue carbon, CCS, CCUS. They need to be, considered to be able to achieve a net zero emission level. So what does a net zero for India's energy sector mean? It would mean a drastic shift from, different processes and fuels and technologies, and it would also mean a behavioral shift, for example, in the terms of electric cooking, towards electric cooking. So, it would entail a lot of behavioral shift, move towards efficient appliances and, electrification of many end users. So all that in the background of, will still, there will be still some emissions which will be, remaining in the energy sector, and owing primarily to the industry sector, and to be very specific, the steel and cement sector are likely to face constraints. And a small contribution is expected from the power sector, however, will be contingent upon the progress in battery storage. Now at the COP26, India has again made some more ambitious announcements, and has increased its climate ambition by announcing also the net zero commitment by 2070. And there's another commitment of achieving 500 gigawatt installed capacity by 2030 through non-fossil fuel sources, and to fulfill 50% of the country's energy requirements from renewables by 2030, and to reduce 1 billion ton of carbon emissions from the total projected emissions by 2030. And finally, the emission intensity reduction of the order of 45% from what was 33 to 35% earlier in its economy by 2030 from the 2005 level. Now, well, when these targets are very well aligned to the global needs, but are quite challenging for India, and definitely will require a lot of global technological cooperation and additional financing requirements. And also, there will be a need to, some dramatic shift also in terms of policy approaches, and innovative decision making will be required to address and enable such transformational shifts. There are also opportunities in the meantime for India to move ahead. Climate policies can be very effective, if they are integrated into broader developmental plans, and they could be strongly tied to the developmental policies, and focus on enhancing socioeconomic and local environmental benefits. There could be also the synergies with local co-benefits such as air pollution, creation of jobs, better health, etc. could be tapped for India to move forward on its sustainable developmental goals and green economic recovery. While all these policies are formulated at the national level, implementation duty lies with the states, and therefore the roles of states is very important. And the systematic and strategic planning is the key to reduce the implementation challenges, and therefore needs effective capacity building and awareness generation. So we suggest a LTS framework which could guide the LTS strategy, and it comprises of 5 elements or 5 pillars. First is the macroeconomic context. So you develop or you establish a macroeconomic context in which you determine the crucial sectors from India's current growth trajectory. So, I would also just emphasize on the fact that this framework is applicable to any country or any economy, and including India. So, the first step requires to set up a macroeconomic context, and it is very important to first determine which sectors contribute to the country's current growth trajectory, and what would be the impacts on those sectors, and how these sectors could be maintained. And the second is development of an analytical framework, which would use realistic assumptions to design forward-looking scenarios. The third will be sectoral transitional mapping, and it would entail classifying the sectors on the basis of ease of abatement, or the ones which are more amenable to decarbonization, and the stage of transition. Fourth is the technology and financial mapping, and this would entail determining needs and available sources for finance and technology. And lastly, very importantly, are the institutional arrangements, which requires you to engage with all the essential stakeholders and effective review mechanism. So, I mean, for the technological and financial mapping, there are three key aspects. One is the need assessments, and second is the resource allocation, and third is the resource mobilization. I would not go into details of these, but I mean, all these three assessments are very essential for each of the categories, which were also identified earlier in the stage, and which also depends on the ease of abatement and stage of transition. Again, coming to the institutional arrangements, and a very strong institutional framework would require stakeholder consultations and a very effective review mechanism to track the progress, and which is required for any country to implement the low carbon long-term strategy. Thank you.